Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another installment of our Ask the Editor series. I am thrilled to be here today with poet and editor Quincy Lehr. Quincy is the editor of the Raintown Review. How are you doing, Quincy?
I'm all right. Solid minus.
Fabulous, fabulous. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. And let's just jump right in. It seems your magazine is going through a bit of a transition phase. So if I understand correctly, you took over as editor somewhat recently. Is that correct?
A couple of years ago.
Okay.
So, I mean, the big thing is that the longtime publisher of the Raintown Review, Central Avenue Press, folded. Like many independent publishers, it was a guy who, when he started it, did not have an adopted special needs child, and now does, and has a whole lot of life going on. So basically, the reason that we don't have a website up right now, first off, I never especially liked the old website. Sorry, Anna. Get that back up. And so we're kind of essentially doing like a relaunch on this issue. We actually changed our numbering on the last issue for we used to be, at least in theory, twice yearly, but it became a bit of a joke. And I kind of rather have it be basically yearly and just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and be good and not be woefully under edited or things like that, than try to, with different life circumstances, crank them out at a different pace.
Right.
I mean, obviously, the other wild card for us has been COVID, that I think everybody found themselves in a very different situation, particularly those of us with day jobs and kids. And so, I am reading the slush. I am, going through and pacing things around. We've got some prose coming in and are on track for a kind of late this year, God willing, the creek don't rise, early next year, if God's less willing and the creek does rise, issue, and new website, and me doing my level best to get the PayPal set up for subscriptions where I don't get zapped by the IRS or something I'm already losing money on. So that's kind of going on right now. So for anyone who wants to submit, the Raintown Review at gmail.com is still very much open for submissions. We are actually, cranking through them at a pretty good pace. Assistant editor Eleanor is at Oxford, so her school doesn't actually begin for a couple weeks. So if you want quick turnaround on the slush, this is the time to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So, very good to know. So this is a good time to submit, and let's just cover basics. You publish, because I initially thought you were just a poetry magazine, but you also publish prose and reviews as well.
Right. Okay. And by prose, I do mean prose about poetry.
Oh, okay.
So the guy who sent us, you cannot make this stuff up, a 600 page novel in Punjabi, just asking for advice.
And did you publish it?
No, I actually kind of turned it over to the underlings and said, hey, would you guys like to write this letter in response for we are a poetry magazine in the English language? And finally they just said,
right.
We've gotten submissions in Turkish, we've gotten submissions in Italian. No, it's like prose. We do poetry reviews, we do kind of broader critical pieces. I'm thinking about doing some stuff on, let's say some of the self-immolating tendencies of the poetry world over the last year and a half or so. I would say we try to have about half of our word count being prose about poetry. And then the poetry, we tend towards poetry that pays attention to form as the kind of wiggle thing. So, predominantly traditional prosody, not entirely. And that's kind of where the magazine came from. That's certainly where I, as a writer, tend to go as far as poetry goes. Iambic pentameter pretty naturally. I think that really for me, the prose is an absolutely crucial part of it. That, particularly speaking as a poet, how many times I've really felt like the book kind of went into a void that either reviews just don't happen. Fewer and fewer places do them all the time, or it's just these circle jerky puff pieces. And so generally the way that we do it is, rather than have someone say, hey, I want to review this book by like my best friend, it's more, okay, if you want to review, let us know, we'll get something sent out to you.
Okay.
Tends to be the way that we do it. And that is in part to keep it at least reasonably honest. Not that I think one needs to go scorched earth particularly all the time, but that you want people's reviews, which are rather few and far between, just given the number of thousands of poetry books released every year, it's actually kind of precious, I think. So that was when I came in as associate editor under Anna Evans in 2009. One of the things I kind of really pushed. Let's have the review section be more than kind of perfunctory.
So if somebody wants to review for the journal, they should just send you an email and say, hi, I'd like to be a reviewer, and then you'll send them poetry books. Okay. Yeah,
send them something. Send me some samples of prose about poetry that you've written, probably would be good as well. We also tend, again, it varies, but tend to want roughly 1,000-word reviews, which is longer than most places do. Again, just because having kind of seen it on the other end, and the sort of feeling when it's 500-word review covering 4 books, and everybody like gets 2 substantive sentences.
Right.
So, that's, I think, one of the things we've been able to do as a magazine, particularly in our quadrant of the poetry world, is to, actually get some discussion about poetry going, as well as, publishing the stuff, which is obviously very important as well.
So when you say prose about poetry, just to clarify, you mean reviews and criticism, not like a short story about a poet?
Not like a short story about a poet. And, as far as my suggestion for her to send those, I don't really have any. Way better than I would. So, my kind of feeling on, obviously, fiction's great. I read a bit of it myself, but it's just not part of my wheelhouse.
Okay. So you mentioned self-immolating poetry. Can you say more about that? Because I don't know if everybody here read Quincy's awesome editorial statement, and I will post that when I share the link, but really powerful, really strong, really opinionated, which is all fantastic. And I know you have strong opinions about sort of the state of poetry, the state of the poetry world. So I'm curious what you mean by self-immolating poetry.
What I mean by that is, so last year, I think, however you feel politically about it, or your opinions on the vaccine versus ivermectin or whatever, is we went into what was clearly a world crisis point, that this pandemic hits, that in the wake of the George Floyd murder, there were protests, above and beyond certainly, but I recall seeing in the Occupy movement, often quite radical in terms of at least such activity, and that the upshot was things like Don Scher is no longer the editor of poetry, and that one of, I think, and part of it's probably Twitter, part of it's that we have this sort of professional managerial class way of looking at, issues of race and diversity and inclusion and various other things you can imagine on a PowerPoint slide at a meeting. That rather than realizing that probably the solutions to these things are largely extra poetic or extra literary, the tendency has been to, purity hunt a great deal within our own ranks. Certainly Tim Green on the chat here, I've seen kind of get unsuccessfully attempted hashtag canceled, on more occasions than I probably know about, and I think Tim has sensibly kind of left the various social media sites that will tend to try to do that to him. Then, I mean, again, the share thing was he published a poem that, I mean, I didn't much care for.
Wait, just to clarify, so this is Don Scher, the editor, or former editor of Poetry Magazine? Okay.
Yeah, so, publishes a poem, not particularly good, took up a lot of real estate. But, was the poet, was Michael, one of the Dickmans. And he was talking about like an older, somewhat racist relative. And this was treated as just an utter case of just white supremacy, as how dare you publish this. This was in sort of along with, poetry had kind of the Poetry Foundation's board had written a kind of perfunctory, Black Lives Matter to us sort of statement. And this had been criticized, wasn't that different than, say, Brooks Brothers. Yes, they also had a statement on Black Lives Matter. And that this whole thing kind of became a way of articulating, who gets, I think, particularly on the fairly large pile of money that the Poetry Foundation is sitting on. For all that I was never a particularly big fan of Don Scher's editorial taste, I do kind of feel like he got a bit of a raw deal on it. And that it has become a situation where, I certainly wouldn't want to be a, guest editor of poetry, which is what they're doing now. So there was that. And then, of course, we have more recently the whole Barron magazine. For those who aren't familiar with the narrative on this, this was their now ex-editor, who declared on Twitter, naturally, that poets are mostly talking to other poets. This then touched off what seems to me to be a fairly moderate Twitter firestorm, and resulted in sorry, just got something going on in the background here. Resulted in Barron deciding to declare that their official take is that poetry does in fact matter, and that the editor is no longer working for them. Obviously, I don't know the office politics here. They could have just let her go, I suppose, and no one would have thought anything of it. My hope is that this becomes something of a shark jump. I mean, people I know who don't particularly pay attention to this stuff are talking about it.
Ben Shapiro tweeted about it, incidentally.
Okay. Yeah, Ben Shapiro, that noted literary critic. The thing is that for me, this was, yes, some people did drop the phrase white privilege in the comments, but let's say people who tend to drop that phrase as a sort of default. The thing that I think is important or not important, or maybe we'll point out how tempest in a teapot this stuff can often get, is that it seemed to mostly be an attempt to get ahead of something, to get ahead of, somebody being mad on the internet. And Twitter is the place that you go to be mad on the internet. It is a sort of form, 240 characters, unless you get the special little, dispensation to go twice the length, which I don't have nearly enough followers to do. So it tends to be pithy. It tends to be sort of like tending towards the zeros in a time that is just depressingly unironic. And so my hope is that the Barron thing, because I never heard of Barron magazine before this happened, and that's nothing against Barron magazine. I understand, to their now former editor's point, toiling in obscurity. This sort of spiral on them in absolutely the wrong way. I'm hoping there's a teachable moment in there, which is just kind of, okay, at a certain point, delete the app from your phone, leave it for 72 hours, at minimum log back in after 72 hours and see if it's gone away, because it probably has.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's hard for me, I suppose, at this point to get too worked up about it, because it's so obviously boomeranged, as opposed to, like I said, what I think happened to Poetry Magazine, and the Poetry Foundation, where they did have some pretty profound shifts,
Mhm.
and not necessarily positive ones, where, if I were having to kind of run through my editorial choices through committee after committee, if I were having to, answer to, supposed equity questions, and where I thought, like, look, if Poetry Magazine wanted, or the foundation wanted to do something about BLM, they have this big, massive, centrally located, fantastically ugly building in Chicago, at a point that the Chicago police were brutalizing protesters.
Mhm.
Just opening up that building, which, I mean, again, because of COVID restrictions, didn't exactly have a whole heck of a lot else going in on it as a kind of safe space, if you will, for protesters, would have done so much more concrete good
Mhm.
than, going through a kind of self-immolating purge.
Mhm.
So I suppose that's part of it. I mean, I think part
Mhm.
of it too is just something that's happened in all the arts, which is that the sense of being married to a cause, and often causes that kind of aren't worth your time, has become greater and greater. And, I'm hardly the first person to make this observation, but, they used to say that the reason that conservative comedy wasn't very good was that the comic would get too angry at the premise of the joke before delivering the punch. So it's like, oh, did you hear the latest one about Obama, the gay Kenyan Muslim? Oh, I hate him so much, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then in some ways that happened, I think, with liberals as well, which maybe gets to, a point for a magazine like mine, or a magazine like anybody's, of the political poem.
Mhm.
Because there will be political poetry. It's, what is going on in terms of interpersonal relationships, on a kind of macro scale, is obviously something worthy of being written on. And that can include not just, things on kind of great metaphorical scales. If you think through the sort of history of poetry, there's a lot that is, where maybe we even remember certain political figures because they were lampooned in a poem.
Mhm.
Um, and I think where, for me, when I think about, like, why I haven't found a lot of what I see published very good, or maybe what separates the wheat from the chaff, along with, well written and fresh metaphors and all that stuff, is if I kind of feel like something is a versified press release for the Democratic Party,
Mhm.
um, regardless of my personal feelings about the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or any other party, it's just not very interesting. If it kind of feels like, last week's Rachel Maddow show, kind of regurgitated, it doesn't interest me. And, I'm not sure it does much for, the hashtag resistance / blue wave / whatever either. And that's not really my affair, but, for those who are more invested in such things. One of the things that I pointed out in my editorial in the last issue that you referred to is that we are dealing with just an absolutely massive crisis on all fronts, whether it be the sort of continued habitability of the planet, or whether it be just a massive pandemic, or whether it be, certainly in Los Angeles, just an absolutely ballooning homeless crisis, and, a system that's utterly dysfunctional about saying, what do we do about housing people and keeping housing costs from absolutely galloping out of control, or whatever. And to, I think, deal with that, and you can deal with that weepily, you can deal with that satirically, you can deal with that all sorts of different ways. But that to deal with it in a sort of partisan way that seems to be increasingly demanded of people, not from any particular partisan group, tends to flatten and brutalize, I think, what poetry can do. And maybe I'm being a post-romantic in this. Maybe the whole unacknowledged part of the unacknowledged legislators, part of Shelley's famous formulation, is important to me. But we, as an art, moved away from being the bard hired by the local chieftain to talk about how awesome he is at stealing cattle from the stupid chieftain in the next valley some centuries ago. And I tend to think that that movement is good, that we have, at a certain cost to perhaps public acclaim or public access, said, nah, we're going to be a bit more independent than that. We can talk about stupid chieftain in the next valley, but even if it means that I don't get to eat at the big table and drink all the meat I want, I am nevertheless able to call the chieftain in my valley a big pile of stupid.
So do you see a lot of political submissions based on, because of your editorial statement, because of your views, do you tend to see a lot of these kinds of submissions?
I would say probably we get, and the good with the bad, absolutely, as well. We probably get a lot of it almost by default, insofar as a lot of form-friendly magazines, that do that as their main thing. So again, hats off to Rattle for taking some poems with rhyme and meter, but that's not their shtick per se. Measure has become a sort of a somewhat occasional online thing. New Walkover in Britain sort of morphed into a chapbook series. Actually, what used to be magazine Measure is now a primarily book press. They published one of mine. So for places that aren't the New Criterion, where you get your poem about peonies, in between the latest from the Bolsonaro regime or something like that. I'm not making that up. I mean, they ran a deeply disturbing, extremely right-wing thing by that Bolsonaro guy who said, various things about, why the Amazon should be turned into a giant Chuck E. Cheese. So, you got that. You've got.
I had to turn down our 3 o'clock today.
Okay. All right, Matthew, I think you're.
Oh, you did.
Someone, I think someone answered a phone call and is unmuted. Maybe Matthew?
Yeah.
So I switched it from yesterday to today.
Okay.
But
Good to know. Okay, well.
I'm going to pause.
We'll have to.
Okay.
All right. Sorry about that.
And we're back. Okay. I know the drill. Having done the online thing for the greater part of the year.
Right.
So, I guess what I was saying there is that you have, in sort of the formal magazine community, is, as far as editorial end, not really writers, but editorial end, has tended to lean right. Certainly there's a big traditionalist Catholic contingent. A lot of the places that pay reasonable amounts of money are, the New Criterion, First Things, which is kind of a right-wing, I guess technically ecumenical, but let's face it, Catholic, magazine in New York City. The National Review, places like that. Then you have, I kind of hesitate to mention them, the Society of Classical Poets, which is basically a Falun Gong operation. So because we are kind of emphatically not that, while not per se being a political magazine, we tend to get a lot of stuff kind of by default, which is understandable and perfectly reasonable. Now that, I think, kind of raises for me kind of why I continue to do this, which is, in spite of not getting any younger and in spite of, 2 kids and, full-time job and all that, is I think we do fill a need in this part of the poetry world. Not just insofar as, not coming from a, sort of relatively, conservative in various ways, sort of point of view, but just even the very basic, like kind of a place you can fuck shit, God damn it, a little bit if you if you feel the aesthetic need to do so. And which maybe that seems odd to say in 2021, but I think it is actually the case in this instance. So yeah, so we, that keeps certainly me going, and does mean I think that we, have a role to play.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for writers who do feel very passionately about a cause, and maybe it is a partisan cause, like maybe they really feel that, it's vital that the Democrats win in 2022, whatever, and how do you sort of transcend that to make good art? Because I'm hearing this actually from a lot of editors, that what we're seeing now is a lot of political writing, which is great. It's great that people are getting involved. It's great that they're sort of funneling their passion and their concerns into art. But how do you transcend some of that, like, reptile brain Twitter rage and actually produce something that is meaningful and a little bit more impartial, maybe?
Right. I think that, and this kind of goes against the sort of workshop drill thing, is I think we have to remember that there's a lot of writing out there, that the first question is, okay, well, why does this particular thing I'm doing need to exist? So I think that it's something that, particularly when you're trying to break in, can be difficult as far as just saying, like, do I, and particularly if you're on a tenure track or something like that, do I have to get this much stuff published? So I think that's part of it. It's just the sort of resisting, saying, okay, well, if I know that this is kind of being blasted out there, do I need to add to the pile? I think a second bit of it is some degree of self-consciousness, self-awareness. And I think that can go a long way for, and particularly if you have a somewhat satirical bent, that, even if you're like all the way in on the Democrats, there's got to be something that, Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or someone like that did, that even as a hyper-partisan Democrat, you're just like, oh man, why'd you do that? Did you have to go and show your fridge full of Jenny's ice cream, in the middle of a pandemic? You can still be a political supporter of Nancy Pelosi and be annoyed by that. I think the other thing to realize is that political writing, it's no different than any of the other topics that the sort of workshop advice is to go cautiously on. Obviously, great love poems get written all the time. Dog shit love poems get written all the time. And the same thing, or nature poems, or sort of I'm looking out of my window and I see bare electric lines and there are skinny ravens on the electric lines, I am sad poems. All these things can be done well, all of them can be done badly, and the same principles apply. So I think one of the biggies is just, you don't get a pass for having good politics. That ultimately, it has to be memorable as art. And that, look, there are some people, 10 to 15 years back there, there were some things that, happened, let's say in the Bush administration, that were darkly hilarious, genuinely hideous, all the rest. I guess I want a poem that I can look at now and remember what a piece of shit Paul Wolfowitz was.
Mhm.
And I think that's the thing. Like, it can be about Paul Wolfowitz, but it needs, just like, the love poem where I do not know the object of your affection. I am probably not in love with the object of your affection, but I still need to feel it. And it's exactly the same.
Mhm.
And that, the sort of stereotyped adolescent thing is, my pain is different. I mean, for me as a poet, one of the big realizations was that my pain is basically the same as everybody else's, and that lets me talk about it. But that goes for politics too, that like, oh man, I put in a zinger on the Cheeto fascist president. Doesn't necessarily, especially, if you are, kind of, rhyming the same, stand-up comic stereotypes from the last 4 years.
Right.
So I think just realize like the level of quality control is the same.
Mhm. Well, I like what you said also about recognizing that these, even as you're rooting for a certain group to succeed, you can recognize that they're fallible. And part of that is also sort of embracing contradiction, which I think is the unique province of literature, right? Like, because politics tends to be so clear cut, or at least they try to make it so clear cut. And literature is where you can get different shades of gray and nuance and contradiction, and sort of embracing that in your poetry and your writing.
Right. And I think that there's something else too that is probably, for all that social media becomes the never-ending kicking bully for these things. But this notion that probably also feeds into QAnon and things like that like, I have a stake in this. I need to do this thing. And if I do this thing right, like my favorite candidate is going to get, 5 more votes from people who read this lit mag, even though they live in different states. And if I fuck it up, then they're not going to get those votes, and it's going to be terrible. And like, no. Maybe going back to the Barron magazine thing, even people who like your poem, even in the unlikely event that they live in the same congressional district as you, are probably going to go in and do what they're going to do regardless of what you said in your poem.
Right.
So you're not operating as a get out the vote machine with your poem.
Yeah, that's an interesting dimension of that whole Barron magazine issue, because I think people probably really resented her tweet, because she's basically saying your poems are not going to affect the outcome of a presidential race, or and a lot of people really feel like, no, this is like the role of poetry right now. Like, everything is so on the cusp of crisis that we all need to galvanize all the time for literature to like speak to this crisis. And I think people felt very maybe threatened by what she was saying.
I mean, the funny thing is, so back when I was in grad school and had access to the Columbia University Library, I remember just for giggles, I went and looked at the very first issues of Poetry Magazine and just read them through. And, Ezra Pound wasn't quite where he'd get in various senses. But Harriet Monroe's initial editorial, I think, was instructive. And that she basically is saying, we are setting this thing up as a deliberately more specialized, rarefied thing relative to the stuff that is being printed in newspapers and mass magazines. And, as someone whose degrees are in history, having gone through 100-year-old newspapers, it's a lot of sort of very easy sentiments and things like, that maybe I wouldn't necessarily read for pleasure. And generally competently rhymed and scanned and all that, though. Very didactic. Where this becomes, I think, relevant to sometimes the discussions of what we've lost is that we kind of lost the top 40 element of it. Maybe something that like happened to jazz in the 60s and 70s probably is happening to rock music now, where it's not a pop art anymore. I think where the question in poetry becomes is less how do we, flash in the pans like, the occasional inaugural poem and such aside, Do we necessarily have either the spectrum or the capacity to have where poetry was 120 years ago when it didn't compete with all sorts of mass media that there is now? Or, hey, maybe poetry could be as big as Sonic Youth.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly for page poetry, as big as Sonic Youth is probably bigger than it is now. So for me, that was kind of, when I think about where I want it to go, and being realistic about, certainly as an independent publication that isn't connected to a university or, someone with, significant amounts of money to spend on it or things like that. That's kind of where I'm thinking, like, okay, well, how do we modestly expand to people who should be kind of into this stuff anyway?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily have any particular magic bullets for that, because the thing had gone semi-dormant when it kind of got handed over to me as the former associate editor. A lot of this is kind of rebuilding and sort of rejuvenating, but there was a point that the Raintown was actually in the black by about $50. We don't really necessarily have that much other than just kind of word of mouth and for organic spread. But I do think that sometimes we lament a bit too much about, most of the people reading this are people who are really into it. Whenever the COVID thing allows, go out and see a local band. See how many people are in other bands, or significant others of people in those bands, and are kind of somewhat bewilderedly dragged along. I mean, that's what a lot of art looks like.
Sure.
Is the aficionados of the thing. And I'm not saying that to be complacent. I'm just saying that to say, like, look, I think all of us, like, hey, if you get to write this stuff, write it because it's fun. If you get some readers, great. If you have a sort of coterie of readers who kind of look at everything you do, even better. If it's not as big as you'd like it, A, join the club, and B, and to expand that. But ultimately, this is not about the big time. This is about an art that I certainly think is important. Hopefully the readers of the Raintown think is important. That we are serving an often underserved part of the poetry community. I would say that the anti-form prejudice in the kind of general poetic community dropped quite a bit over the last decade and a half, and it seems to have kind of come roaring back a little bit in the last couple of years. So I do kind of feel like having a form-oriented journal, still makes sense. Is that going to be the case forever? Who knows? Also that was kind of the bailiwick I inherited. So yeah,
really quickly, because I forgot to say it at the beginning, if anyone has questions, feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat, and I will work them into my questions with Quincy. So just to clarify, do you publish poetry that is not political? Like, if it's just...
Oh yeah.
So it's like, because we've talked obviously a lot about politics and your politics and politics in general, but if somebody just sends a beautiful formal poem that is about love, or is about moon, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we publish poems about, like, the color of the sky. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And yeah, because I think amongst other things, one of the things maybe that art does allow us to do, even if not per se just the escape, is to realize, and I think for many of us, when you turn off the Twitter and you go outside a little bit, is accepting that maybe the entire fate of the world doesn't rest on you, and maybe no one is asking, and maybe sometimes that cloud looks really cool, or your kid went off to kindergarten and, you get that little tear in your eye.
That happened to me this morning.
Yeah.
I should write a poem about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, with my son, I'd probably write a poem about the frustration of the half-hour traffic jam.
Exactly. Yeah.
Get in and get them checked off and all that. But yeah, all that stuff is still, I think, absolutely relevant.
And I would also sort of argue that it is kind of a political act to take a step back and not engage with all the noise and the fire and brimstone, and just sort of like look at a leaf, and to hold a moment and not rush through it.
Right. Look at a leaf, think about, again, and I say this as someone who teaches history for a living, is stepping back and thinking about the moment that you're in without thinking about it in terms of, what agenda am I trying to in my own life get forward. But yeah, sometimes, like you said, just I think being a certain age, being seeing someone else at a certain age. There's kind of that Onion article after 9/11 happened of like, oh, if my stake takes more than 15 minutes to get here, then the terrorists have won. You don't like everything becomes an act of heroism.
Right.
But also, look, nice things are nice. That
and also providing that comfort to other people who are in the middle of all the frustration and craziness, to just sort of read something kind of chill.
And certainly because we don't do themed issues or things like that, and fine if you're an editor who does, I try not to have too much of the same thing in any given issue, whether that be poems about X or poems about Y. Once we had to reject a perfectly good poem because it was a woman's name and we'd already taken a poem with the same woman's name that was completely different.
Oh, no way. That was the only reason it was rejected?
Yeah,
wow.
And fortunately at the time, then editor Anna had an online journal.
Okay.
So she said, hey, we can publish it over here.
Wow.
The second guy was like, okay, yeah, I can do that. So it worked out. But, another thing with a poetic journal is, we get lots and lots of sonnets, and it's a great old form. There's a reason it's been in vogue since the Renaissance. But you can get sonnet fatigue. So I have to at least be able to kind of separate them out with some other forms, or you say, oh, wow, we've taken a lot of quatrains, or a couple of villanelles an issue is fine. So with subject, same thing with form, that you want to have sufficient variety in whether it be voices or subject matter, or just physically form, long poems versus short poems. We are a long poem friendly publication. I know a lot of places aren't, so again, that's something we sometimes kind of get by default, is the longer pieces since we'll do them. So I think that's another thing to consider, is when you submit to any form journal, we tend to see the more popular forms a lot. Now that doesn't mean don't go out and write sonnets. It just means if you send us 5 sonnets, particularly late in a submission cycle, and since we basically have it open all the time, at least right now, you don't know where in the submission cycle we are. You're just running a certain risk. So, I would say to would-be submitters, having a variety of things makes sense, because, we're not just sort of abstractly saying, okay, this one, this one, this one, this one. Wow, 90% of our poems are, in quatrains and, approximately a page long. You don't really want to do that. So, all of these things are in the mix in ways that you as a submitter don't necessarily know.
And so you publish, it's all formal poetry, which just means no free verse, but anything else.
Right. Yeah. Or for that matter, you can have a formal poem that isn't metrical. And certainly we've published some of those. I basically just want to see a sort of an interest in prosody, in the actual sort of physical properties of language, and patterning them accordingly. So there are some free verse forms out there.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, let's say, Sistina's also a little goes a long way, but you don't necessarily have to have a medical Sistina, although they frequently are.
Okay.
For
And
a while.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on.
How many poems should a person submit at once?
No more than 6.
Oh, okay. And it all over email and just
All over email. One email, please. Paste it into the body is just easier for my number of windows open on the screen at any given time. If there's something where you feel the format is real important, attach something and say, hey, this thing because I need the indents just so. Do keep in mind, I think for both the Raintown and anywhere else, if your poem is real persnickety as far as physical layout on the page, that is certainly as a combination of editor, typesetter, and copy editor, something that I am going to think about as I am looking at the thing, like how much do I really want to do with this, with the distinct possibility that I'm going to receive an angry note after the thing gets published. No, you were supposed to have 4 indents there and you only put in 3. And I'm like, okay. So, these are, I think, things that sometimes poets need to think about a little bit more of, okay, I have to lay this thing out. And again, independent thing, it's me laying it out in Adobe. So, yeah.
And if a set of poems is rejected, should the writer just keep trying you, or do you want them to wait a little while?
We ask for no more than 2 submissions every 6 months.
Okay.
And I would say, if you get rejected, again, I bring up, we told the author in question, about hey, we already took a poem with the same name. The thing that I've really realized as an editor is if you don't get specific feedback, you really don't know. You don't know whether the editor thought that your submission was garbage or whether it's just like, yeah, we got too many sonnets. Like, maybe had you submitted it 6 months, and I don't like holding things just because it takes a certain amount of bandwidth for me to remember, oh yeah, I said I do this one. So, a year and a half later, here we go. I'm just not that organized. Some people are. So what I would say there is, yeah, just, don't, in addition to don't take it too personally, don't assume you know what's going on in my brain or any other editor's brain. And, remember that, look, we are doing our best to come up with a coherent magazine, a readable magazine, a magazine with, variety and interest according to our own bailiwicks. We are, however, also, humans. We're subjective. We are, sometimes saying, wow, the slush pile's really piled up. Let's see what's going on in here. It's a different level of reading there. Another thing to note is, what kind of reading you're getting. That I am certainly going to, not be going in with the mindset, I'm going in with the mindset that I want to see something I can use. That said, I am also not, poring over things, asking master's degree students to write theses on your submission, spending days and days on it. That, even if we are not at the acme of popularity, this is still intended to be entertainment. So I'm usually looking for something that kind of gets me on the first read. And that's me. I'm not sure it's everybody, but that's certainly me.
So who is it, you screening the submissions and then a few other editors? What is the staff?
So the staff right now is me as the editor. We've also got Michael Brown and Eleanor Harvey as my assistants. They will periodically go through the slush as well. Some days you get me, some days you get them. My feeling is, rather than, sometimes it just causes me to get sad when I hear, editors of fairly prominent journals who, solicit at least 60% of what they're getting. And, that you're at a conference and you asked, who are saying like, oh, I typically get 70,000 submissions and I read them all. It's like, oh, yeah, why are you doing this to yourself? I'd rather have a 22-year-old who has the bandwidth to actually process what I'm doing, read this thing, whatever you are doing to read literally hundreds of submissions a day, if that's what you're doing. So, again, there are different schools of thought on these things. But yeah, so, I certainly picked both Eleanor and Michael based on, they're younger than me. They have a little bit more bounce to the ounce. But also, highly intelligent, perceptive people whom, my hope is if they play their cards right and stick around for a while, I can hand this thing over to them in a couple of years.
Ah, okay.
So,
and I'm guessing, just based on your politics, that cover letters are probably not that, like, seeing someone's long list of fancy credentials is not going to sway you one way or the other.
Right. What I do want, though, is I would like a third person bio, which is where you would say, I've been in, the lower back pain review or whatever. Like here's the thing. Occasionally, what the cover letters do is kind of establish, like, okay, maybe here's the context I'm reading this thing in. Like, okay, well, that's a lot of not particularly formalist magazines. So, okay, well, someone may be coming in it from a different angle. No, certainly we've published plenty of people where it's like their first publication. I've rejected people who've been in some of the leading magazines in the world, and everything in between. The main reason I think that you want to do a cover letter is, without telling me your life story, that I think me and every other magazine editor kind of want at least a little sense that there is some cogitation for why your magazine. Why am I, of the hundreds upon hundreds of magazines, sending this batch of poems to you? And you don't really need to say much in a cover letter. Dear Quincy, here are 5 poems. My third person bio is this. My email address, if you choose to publish, is this. Sincerely yours. And also, like, to your point, just, I like short biographical notes. I think my current biographical note when I submit is, last couple of books. I think I've gotten places I've appeared down to continents. So it's, North America, Europe, and Australia, I think is what I say now, like lots of places in those places. And then, he's rad or something. So, it's almost like kind of trying to get a haiku, like, biographical note. Because really, like, what do you as a reader want to get? Well, you're probably not going to be getting someone, going out and buying all the last 10 magazines you were in because they think you're that rad. If you got a book, you should mention it. Maybe someone reads your poem, likes it, and says, okay, I'm going to hie me over to, Bond villain website, Amazon, and, type it in and order the thing up. So like, definitely mention your last book if you got one.
Of course. Yeah. So what, so the website will be up soon, and will it be, is you mail print copies of the journal, but do you also publish content online?
We've tended to do some, like, samples just to give people an idea of what's in there. A couple of representative prose things. We have not put the entire issue online, typically just for the, like, you've got to pay the pretty modest amount of money. I want to just kind of look at where costs are at to, keep me from, completely blowing the mortgage on this thing. But it was, I think, about $10 an issue.
Okay.
So yeah, you want people to buy it. You want to kill some trees for poetry. But yeah, so we send out, contributors' copies to contributors. Again, look, nobody makes any money from this. Back in the old days, Anna Evans and I used to do the New Jersey Lit Festival, and we kind of take whatever money we made off of selling our sort of personal editor copies of the things, and, like, go out and get moderately tipsy after that festival. That was our
Mm.
our payment. So, no, this is, again, independent publishing.
Yeah.
We don't pay, but I don't get paid.
Mhm.
And indeed, but it would be reasonable to say that probably in the near future, I will get the opposite paid.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
So I'm very curious because I know you have a lot going on. You're a teacher, high school teacher. You're a dad of 2 little ones, and now you're a homeowner. So what keeps you in the lit mag biz? And do you ever just want to ditch it? And what like on those days where you're like, there's too much on my plate, I can't handle it. What keeps you coming back to the work of an
Like I said, I think what keeps me coming back is that the Raintown was there when other sort of form-friendly magazines weren't, for a fair number of writers that I know.
Mhm.
That we were keeping some conversations going, even getting some conversations started that weren't there otherwise.
Mm.
This isn't necessarily good for, the state of my gut or intestines or whatever. It's not necessarily, something that's terribly easy for me to do right
Right.
now. But it is, it really would leave a void if it weren't there.
Mm.
And also, my sense is that there are, if you will, the next generation, whom, I can sort of hand the thing off to without them having to start from scratch
Mhm.
and figuring out, oh, how do I copy edit poetry? How do I, figure out, okay, with prose, how much do we want to have kind of orthography based on, like, okay, someone sends in something in British spellings, do we put it into American spellings or not? I have a whole style template for these
Mhm.
things. So, that's something I can kind of, hand on. I think also just, the number of, sort of journals has proliferated, and it's often, good to have one that's been around for a while.
Mhm.
Raintown has been around for a while. It's, I think the greater part of 2 decades now.
Wow.
Harvey Stand, the original, chapbook style
Mhm.
version of it. We went down before my time. And so, that, actually having some things with a bit of a, pedigree within, whatever proportions guarded, is useful. It
Yeah.
is, and something for those starting out to say, oh yeah, I've been in this place that maybe you've heard of.
Mhm. And is there a way for people to get more involved? Are you ever looking for additional readers, volunteers, interns, editors, anything like that?
Right. I think as far as that side of things, we're good. I would say this is a general sense if you're a writer trying to break in a little bit more.
Mhm.
Lots of people don't do criticism.
Mm.
And, we certainly get a lot less requests, a lot less attempts to get in as critics than we do as poets.
Mm.
And it is not a terrible way of getting on the radar, whether for us or probably for many other places as well. That if you can do it, if you, are capable of basically writing essays
Mm.
and, sticking to the subject and, having kind of interesting things to say, you're in good stead. So I would say if someone were looking to get more involved in the Raintown, that is, I think, an obvious place to start.
Okay, great. And also you have a Twitter account
We
where
do.
people should follow the Raintown Review on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So we got the big picture of Cthulhu on there as our avatar. I mean, I'm not super active with the Twitter account
Mhm.
for the magazine right now. Certainly we do kind of blast out announcements and things like that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Kind of try to go judiciously on it.
Right. And again, submissions are open now. The website, maybe sometime in the winter.
Yeah,
Okay.
Google around on us a little bit.
Yeah. I'll
See.
share it once it's up. I'll be sure to update.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'll keep you posted.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Quincy. This is really interesting. It's great to meet you in person.
Absolutely.
Thanks for taking the time.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.